Hello, hello. So I'm going to talk about, and I hope you will give a listen. And because I have an audience in various countries, in case you're not familiar with the things going on in the USA regarding homelessness, well, there's a very large crisis of homelessness. I think a lot of people think of America as this like richest country on earth and whatnot. Well, it has its strong points, but there has been an increasing crisis of homelessness to the point where cities just have many, many blocks and blocks and blocks of people just living on the streets. A lot of it is because of mental illness and substance abuse, but there's other reasons. Either maybe it's criminal convictions, they can't get employed, or just a lot of undocumented people who were brought here with the idea that they're going to have jobs, and they're shifted over into certain areas. There's not enough jobs, or for whatever reason they can't get employed. A lot of undocumented people are also living in tents. So this one I'm going to discuss this specific thing. Now, in fairness, this particular USA Today, I think they're kind of, I wouldn't say they're being deceptive, but they're kind of sugar coating what this executive order is, almost to the point of compassion towards homeless people. And as a veteran for over 30 years and a war vet, and I have groups on Facebook which thousands of veterans in it, I know a lot of things that's happening in VAs across the country and the problems with getting proper mental care. Okay, there's a lot of homeless veterans also. So I'm going to go into the details because what they're not talking about, what it can be used for, and what things that's going to hit snags that it's not going to be enforceable. So I'm going to talk about the logistics of enforcing this order. And I don't agree with misappropriate. Basically, when we vote for our congressmen to vote on specific programs, presidents don't generally have authority to just take that appropriated, voted for funds and put it to something else. Now, if it falls under the same purview of the same kind of content that the money was appropriated for, but anyways, so here's basically what it's called. It is called Ending Crime and Disorder of America's Streets. And what he wants to do now in America, in case you're not familiar, okay, in America, pretty much almost every state in our country has statutes where somebody can be involuntary hospitalized for evaluation and determination on whether or not they need forced treatment. And it generally involves safety, meaning they're a threat of harm to themselves or others. And usually that can be enforced it really could be, in my mind, enforced for drug addiction because you basically are slowly killing yourself. It is a harm to yourself. However, they don't. Okay? It's more like somebody who's got acting like they're going to hurt somebody, like physically. That's generally when they use something like that. Or they're suicidal, something like that. But putting them in a long term, like a state institution, a state hospital, is a longer process because you have to have due process. They have to be given an attorney. Literally, it's a due process thing. So if somebody's going to have their freedom taken from them, they're going to be put in a state hospital, which they do lose their freedom in a sense. It's not prison, but it's still, you're confined. You don't have freedom to go, and you lose your freedom. So that requires due process, a hearing, and an attorney. So that logistics is going to be extremely expensive. Then you have space of state hospitals that is extremely limited as it is. So yeah, let's talk about the logistics of this and also what it's going to do with the undocumented people who are in various places living in tents. So recent things if people have been following, I don't know if you have or not, or maybe if you're from another country you're not familiar with it, because I do have quite a wide view from people around the world that watch my channel. Even though I'm a little bitty channel, I still have a lot of people from various countries. So in the United States of America, they have just our upper courts have ruled that this ICE stuff going on where they're just grabbing people while they're in the process of arrest of people who they were actually going out after. The ICE is our immigration control enforcement, so they send out specific Department of Law Enforcement officers to go into places who have criminal pending charges or have already got convictions. And a lot of times they've been grabbing up people that are just there that are undocumented while they're doing those arrests. And that's caused a lot of upset, because generally people really don't complain as much about the Republicans using ICE under Obama and Biden and the Democrats, they don't care. They don't pay any attention when ICE is going around arresting, undocumented people. They just don't care because, it's politics. The only time they really get upset is when the Democrats start using it as a political weapon, even though they did the same thing under Democratic demonstration. It's politics. But they've been going around in places like most contentious, I would say, is California and LA, and arresting people, and they're grabbing up people that may not be on the list of arrests. And so they have ruled in courts that you cannot arrest them without the probable cause. So this is something that can be used, and it's going to be really hard for them to fight this in court. So here's how it's broke down on how and who can. This is why the way this is worded is really important. And so a lot of people complain about people that stole into the country, if you will, meaning they didn't use ports of entry, they didn't come here under valid refugee program, and they just snuck in, they weren't vetted, and they caused harm to immigrants who were vetted, being put in hotels like in New York, what Pakistan owned hotel. They would just stick them all in there, and they were actually harming immigrants by putting people who weren't vetted in there, who were dangerous. And you know what I mean? That wasn't fair to them. Okay, so nobody and in America, if you're a homeless person and you go into, say, a Catholic charity, for just as an example, there's a lot of ministries who take in homeless people. They don't let in dangerous people either. So if you're somebody with a violent criminal conviction or whatever, you're not going to get in there. Like, I don't know, maybe they'll help you some other way, but they don't subject vulnerable people who are already homeless and struggling with people who are violent. They don't do that. So neither should they do it to immigrants either, but they did, just because, immorality. Anyways, so here's what they're going to do with this particular executive order. Shifting homeless individuals into long-term institutional settings. Now, they've already ruled that basically undocumented people are not eligible for, Medicaid and stuff like that, which a lot of this is, there's going to be a lot of funds to provide for these people in these state institutions. That's why he's saying he's taken billions of dollars to put towards, this project, if you will. And keep in mind, it's not fair to classify everybody who's living in a tent as suffering from mental illness or substance abuse, although there is a large amount of that are for those reasons. It has data that has been just basically monitoring this homelessness for a long time. So, but I think it's stereotypical. But what will happen is they'll collect these people who's living in tents in these areas, and they will be evaluated and assessed on whether or not they're actually have a mental health problem or substance abuse. And then if they don't, then they're just going to go back out on the street. It was like, well, you don't really qualify because you have to have a mental health issue or substance abuse in order for them to take possession of their freedom, and then subject them to the due process, start that due process, if you will, on whether or not they're going to go into a long-term institutional setting, meaning a state hospital, right? Which already has limited. But keep in mind, it's going to be up to a judge, because a judge is going to, in that due process hearing, the judge is going to rule whether or not that person should be institutionalized. And these judges are not, there's a lot of them in the liberal areas are not going to go along with what Trump is wanting to do. They're just be like, yeah, no, we're not going to institutionalize this person. Maybe subject them to outpatient care, and maybe that they will have to respond to the court or something like that. But some areas, though, this is definitely going, but for some strange reason, it seems to be in these liberal cities that happen to have sanctuary cities where the largest amount of homelessness occur. But it's always usually the cities that you see these tent cities and stuff, right? Okay, so they're surrounding the cities and citizens to disorder and fear. It's not compassionate to the homeless nor other citizens. So my administration will take a new approach focused on protecting public safety, restoring civil commitment. So he's got an order to the Attorney General. Now keep in mind, because there's already statutes in place that give authority to law enforcement to, if they think somebody's a harm to themselves, but it's kind of at their discretion on what they feel is a harm to themselves or others, whether or not they're going to enforce that statute. So this is giving a directive to law enforcement that you're going to consider this issue here as a harm to themselves, right? So because there's already statutes in place, and those statutes have been upheld to the United States Supreme Court, right? They're going to find it. That's going to be hard for them to fight this in court. Now, as long as they get due process before they state institutionalize somebody, they should get treatment. But a lot of them can't get treatment. They do want treatment because they don't have insurance, right? Okay. So they're going to provide assistance to state and local governments through technical guidance, grants, or other legally available means for identification. Let's look at the very vague use of this and look at the logistics of the applicable uses of this. Legally available means for the identification. That means whether or not this person is eligible, because if you're undocumented, you're not, and implementing this maximally flexible civil commitment. So, if you're rounded up and you're not documented and you ain't got no proof that you came here in a legal way, guess what? They're going to be turned over to ICE. That's right. They just created a huge way to round up a whole lot of people. But again, logistics, this ain't going to fly in liberal areas because they're just not going they're going to get kickback is what they're going to do if they see this happening, right? So, ICE is a federal agency, not a state agency. So, it's really about the enforcement of this on whether or not they're going to enforcement. Okay. The step-down treatment standards that allow for the appropriate commitment and treatment of individuals with mental illness who pose a danger. Now, keep in mind, this is also not just everybody who's mentally ill, but you have to have a mental illness that poses a danger to others. So that's going to be completely subjective to a psychologist, psychiatrist, whoever is doing the assessment and evaluation when they're rounded up. But this is where it gets interesting. Now this is very vague, living on the streets and cannot care for themselves. So that's where it says you don't even have to have a mental illness. You're just living on the streets and can't care for yourselves. Boom. And there it is. So basically what happened under Biden administration, you had millions of people caravanning, a lot of times paid for by elitists that were shipping them here, and completely unlawfully, because there's caps on how many people can come here for refugee status each year set by Congress under federal statutes. And so they were bringing him in, and it's like, I think it's not even it's like, I don't know, it can change, but it's usually around $250,000 per year, and they're bringing them in by the millions. And then you got YouTube with their ads, I'm sure everybody has seen, talking about, you click on this link and you'll get a benefit card from the government, getting thousands each month. So they had that heavily all day long, spreading those ads while they're luring people, undocumented people, to this country, who a lot of them didn't use the ports of entry, so they just came in, and so they don't even have any application. A lot of them did, even if they did sneak in and use ports of entry, they still applied. But they have a lot of people who were given the false pretenses that they can come here, they're not going to be punished for even if they snuck in, they're being very liberal and lenient, and they can work and send money home. And a lot of them had that idea that they're going to be able to do that. So then you had Governor Abbott from Texas, who's shifting people up there to New York and other places in the sanctuary cities. And they just were overwhelmed with the resources, and they just didn't have the many jobs. There were a lot of people who were willing to hire them, even though legally they didn't have the work permit that's required for them to have. Nonetheless, they just didn't have the jobs that they thought that they would have. So then they have them in these shelters, and then you had that drama about, well, they're extending the shelter, but then you start kicking them out of the shelters. So the bottom line is you have a lot of undocumented people who are homeless, just surviving, right? That's where they're going to fall under this, are living on the streets and cannot care for themselves, because this "or" is here after mental illness who pose a danger to them others. Okay, it's not like he's saying that, but he kind of is. That's why it's really vague. If you're living on the streets, cannot care for themselves, that's some sort of mental illness. Yeah, there's a lot of people that just for whatever reason, they lost their job. COVID happened and a lot of people lost their jobs. Or it might be that maybe they have a criminal conviction and nobody will hire them, or just for whatever reason. Okay? They just they're just on hard times. That's a small percentage of our homelessness crisis in our country. But to be fair, don't judge people like they're mentally ill because they're in hard times. That's not cool, all right? But in the same regard, a lot of homelessness is due to mental illness, and it's sad because they need help. Fighting vagrancy on American streets. The Secretary of Health and Human Services, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and the Secretary of Transportation shall take immediate steps to assess their discretionary grant programs and determine whether priority for those grants may be given to the grantees in states and municipalities that actively meet the below criteria. Meaning, okay, so this is another thing that he's attacking. You're not going to get the money, okay, for any kind of homeless program, all right? So basically, this is taking money away in a way without saying it's taking money away, but it is. Because there's something very controversial going on in our country that actually, if you've seen documentaries on homelessness and drug use, it's happening in other countries as well. But it's extremely immoral. And I know there's controversy and there's people think that it's compassionate, but they have drug stations where they're controlling their drug use. And I'm sorry, if you're giving them poison to continue the damage to their body instead of giving them medicine to prevent them from taking drugs, then you are a part of the problem. But in our own country, that is happening. And that's going to stop. Enforcing prohibitions on open illicit drug use, prohibitions on urban camping and loitering, prohibition on urban squatting, and enforce where necessary, adopt standards that address individuals who are a danger to themselves or others and suffer from serious, okay, now there's the serious mental illness can vary from statute to statute, state to state on what serious mental illness actually is, or substance abuse disorder, or who are living on the streets and again cannot care for themselves. Okay, you don't have to be mentally ill to fall into that category, right? Through assisted outpatient treatment, but they're trying to classify anybody that's basically out on the street, and that's not going to fly, right? But people may not have money to sue, but I'm sure there's going to be groups that will, this is going to meet resistance in court, I promise you. Through assisted outpatient treatment, or by moving them into treatment centers or other appropriate facilities via civil commitment or other available means. Now, facilities can just be a whole range of different private organizations with facilities, okay? Substantially implement and comply to the extent required the registration, and here you go, registration and notification obligations of Sex Offender Registry Notification Act, okay, because there's a lot of them that don't have fixed address, so they're going to address that. Ensure that the homeless individuals arrested for federal crimes are evaluated consistent with the statute here to determine whether they are sexually dangerous persons and certified accordingly for civil commitment. So they want to commit anybody who's had a sexual conviction, go through assessment, of course, for civil commitment, basically taking their freedom from them. This is where they're going to hang nails, because anytime you're facing civil commitment long term, basically anything other than a 72-hour commitment, they're going to have a due process, and it's up to the judges, right? And whether or not they agree with this program. Take all necessary steps to ensure the availability of funds. Now, this is money that's appropriated, basically misappropriated, and I'm curious to see if anybody's going to challenge his use of these funds that was voted for. Every single dollar used in our federal programs is voted on by our legislators, okay? Assess federal resources to determine whether they may be directed toward ensuring, to the extent permitted by law, that detainees, now keep in mind, they're calling them detainees, okay? That's somebody who's being arrested. They're calling anybody who's homeless a detainee with serious mental illness are not released to the public. This rich guy. Oh my gosh, he just wants to get rid of all these people who are poor. Oh my goodness, yes. Don't let them out. He says lock them up. But we're going to do it in a nice way. We're going to lock them up in a nice way. Okay. Okay, Trump. Serious mental illness are not released into the public. Don't let them out. Yeah, it's just not going to fly, guys. I mean, some of this stuff will be successful, and a lot of this is needed, though. That's what's so sad. It's like, don't put nasty stuff in here with stuff that's actually needed because of a lack of forensic bed capacity at local, state, and federal jails or hospitals. So, as I said earlier about the issue with there are extremely already limited bed space in facilities and state hospitals. So, without saying that we're going to lock them up in jail, this is what they're saying, guys. Okay. So, they're going to assess federal resources to determine whether they may be directed toward ensuring to the extent permitted by law. Keep this finger, you can say this, right? But permitted by law. Oh my goodness. The detainees who are seriously mentally ill after they've been assessed that they can't be let out just because there's no capacity. So if there's no space in a hospital, this is what we're going to interpret this to say. If there's not, we're going to break it down. If there's no space in a hospital, put them in jail. Yeah, right? That's what they're saying. Jails or hospitals. Now, he's saying right here that jails is considered a place to put a mentally ill person. Yeah, no, that's not going to fly, yo. This is not Russia. This is not North Korea. This is the United States of America, y'all. The detainees, I'm going to just read it again. Detainees with serious mental illness are not released into the public because of a lack of forensic bed capacity at appropriate local, state, and federal jails. Keep in mind, he just said put them in jails or hospitals. Unless, oh my gosh, enhanced requirements to prisons and residential. Now, here's another thing. Any people who are already convicted and are currently in prison serving a sentence should not be like if you serve a sentence in the United States of America and you're not let out on parole or probation, you just served your time. Like, you're done. Your time is up. Okay? Most people get out on prison or, probation. They may have to serve after their sentence or whatever. But if somebody, for whatever reason, maybe they were naughty in prison or something, kept getting in trouble, and they got maxed out. They didn't get any good time, and they're free. They're just like free to go. You can't lock them up. They're done. Their time is up. But he's wanting to use this. He's wanting to lock up everybody that he thinks might be a menace to society. I mean, this is just insanity in a sense. Okay, to receive funding from the Attorney General, require in-custody housing release plans, and to the maximum extent practicable, require individuals to comply. Wow. Right? If you want funding, you better go with the flow, yo. That's what he's saying. Okay. Anyways, redirecting federal resources towards effective methods of addressing homelessness. Now, keep in mind, when he was in office before for 4 years, I mean, we have 22 veterans a day committing suicide. And the VA hospital is responsible for our veterans, okay? And the homelessness, why aren't you giving money to the VA to specifically go towards homeless veterans? Okay, like there's nothing that's going to separate the veterans in this particular executive order to be treated any different. Like you're going to lock up even veterans who went to war and and have severe, maybe they have brain injury or PTSD. I mean, this is not cool, right? They should be given money or have something in here to say that separate the veterans, because you already gave money to the VA. It's supposed to be addressing veteran homelessness, okay? Because anyways, to ensure that discretionary grants issued by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration for substance use disorder prevention, treatment, and recovery fund evidence-based programs do not fund programs that fail to achieve adequate outcomes, including so-called harm reduction or safe consumption. So basically, if you don't go along with this, you're not going to get money. And this is what he's telling the cities, right? He's like sending a warning. Yeah. So provide technical assistance to assisted outpatient treatment programs for individuals with serious mental illness or addiction during and after the civil commitment process, focused on shifting individuals off the streets and public programs and into private housing and support networks. This is long overdue, but it's just like a fantasy. I mean, the logistics of actually making this happen, they just don't have enough facilities. Maybe it'll help some. I mean, if it helps even a small percent of the crisis that's happening, I mean, that will be a good thing, right? Oh boy, but let's see what happens with immigrants, the undocumented people living in tents. Yeah. To ensure that federal funds for federally qualified health centers and certified community behavioral health clinics reduce rather than promote homelessness by supporting to the maximum extent permitted by law comprehensive services for individuals with serious mental illness and substance abuse disorder, including crisis intervention services. The Attorney General shall prioritize available funding to support the expansion of drug courts and mental health courts for individuals for which such diversion serves public safety. Now, I would hope that if, veterans are collected in this roundup, if you will, that they would refer them to the VA hospitals, right? Because that's they've got funds from our government. They get funds every year for that purpose. So they need to make sure that those funds are used for the vets at the VA hospitals. Anyways, because they do have wards in hospitals that maybe it's not like being institutionalized, but they can keep them there for long terms. Increasing accountability and safety, but again, long term, even in a VA hospital or state hospital, beyond a 72-hour requires due process. So I can't. The courts are going to be the one that's subject to. The Secretary of Health and Human Services and Secretary of Housing and Urban Development shall take appropriate actions to increase accountability in their provision of grants supported for homelessness assistance and transitional living programs. Now, there's been a lot of people who have been calling for people who's getting out of prison who may be having mental health problems. There's a lot of incarceration among the mental health part of our society, unfortunately, and there is a need for transitional housing for prisoners, and there just isn't. But when somebody's got violent offenses, then they kind of have their own, they generally don't qualify for a lot of stuff. They have to have specific housing for that. And I don't know if some of these funds will actually cause that to happen. We shall see. Policies that deprioritize accountability and fail to promote treatment, recovery, and self-sufficiency, increasing competition. Now let's note that word right there. Increasing competition among grantees through broadening the applicant pool and holding grantees to higher standard of effectiveness. So the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development shall, as appropriate, take steps to require recipients of federal housing and homeless assistance to increase requirements that persons participating in the recipient programs who suffer from substance abuse disorder or mental illness use substance abuse treatment or mental health services. A condition, they have to have a condition for this participation. So it kind of sounds like they're going to treat homelessness as a form of mental illness, because you're out there, you're poor, you can't get a job or whatever, or you lost your job and you're homeless. They're going to treat that, from what it looks like, as a mental illness. With respect to recipients of federal housing and homelessness assistance that operate okay, here's what I was talking about earlier. You will not be having controlled drug use stations. This has been so controversial for so long. It's disgusting. It really is. And I'm not trying to judge people who have addiction to these drugs. I just think it's sad that they're enabling when they're giving them drugs, but they're controlling it. Safe consumption sites. That's so ridiculous. They should be getting treatment, even if it's forced treatment, because they're killing themselves slowly, and it's sad, right? It really is. And, a lot of them, there's like a lot of crime involved. It doesn't mean everybody who's using hard drugs is committing crimes, but there's a lot of crime that's connected to drug use, all right? And so this is ridiculous. Our tax dollars should never be used for controlled, giving them drugs. You're providing safe consumption sites. It's just ridiculous. So he's going after this, right? Attorney General shall review whether such recipients are in violation of federal law, including this statute here, and bring civil or criminal actions in appropriate cases, right? So let's look this up right here to show you what that is. maintaining the drug involved premises. So they will prosecute people who think that they're going to get by with doing that again. A lot of times there's a lot of stuff criminal going on, they just don't enforce the law, just because if people don't agree with the law, then they just won't enforce it. And that a lot of that in immigration, there's abuse of immigration, which is a harm to people who 33 conflicts around the world actually need refugee status, and they can't because there's such an overwhelmed system, because they're just misusing the programs, right? So this is basically what this is. Okay, they're going to prosecute them. The statutes are already in place, so this shouldn't be taking place. None of that should be happening because there's federal statutes that prevent it, but it's not being enforced. So this is under the directive to enforce the law, basically. And the United States Attorney General, if they find people not enforcing that law, instead enabling it, you're going to jail, right? The Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, in coordination with Attorney General, shall review whether such recipients are in violation of the terms of the programs, pursuant to which they receive the federal housing. So this is going to go, there's a lot of grants and different stuff they're going to withhold funds if you ain't going with the flow, right? Anyways, allow or require the recipients of federal funding for homelessness assistance to collect health-related information that the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development identifies as necessary to the effective and efficient operation of funding program from all persons to whom such assistance is provided. Now, keep in mind, when it comes to immigration, because there was a lot of people when Biden had the open borders and they just weren't like trying to enforce, and a lot of people snuck in and avoided the ports of entry, there's a lot of people that aren't on the list with ICE as having previous convictions because they don't know who they are to know whether or not. So the people who fall under the list that they want the most to round up, if you will, are people with pending charges or have convictions because they would have never been eligible. It's any country in the world. You're not going to be able, like if you want to go to Canada, you want to go to England, you want to go to wherever, if you have violent convictions, you're not going to be eligible. That's just the way it is. It's for protection of society. So these people who snuck in, they would not be eligible. And I'm not saying everybody that voided the ports of entry did so because they were, sinister or have convictions. A lot of people were just exhausted traveling such a far way, and they're just trying to get in just as quick as they can. They're just exhausted and they're hungry, so they find the nearest spot to sneak in, right? But it makes them subject to, being looked at cross-eyed. So there's a lot of people who are here that may have convictions in the countries that they come from, and they're not on the ICE list because they just never checked in when they snuck in. And so they can find out who these people are. So when they use this program, and I'm telling you, it will be used, and don't let anybody say that it's not, because watch and see. And don't listen to the mainstream media, who's basically a lot of them who was like, even on the left, some of the mainstream media is just, a lot of people are like, are they like not hating on Trump anymore? It's like, yeah, well, when they upheld that they can't even go to the White House and be a part of that, they can be banned from there, because if you're not, saying things that he wants you to say, then yeah, they know where they're gonna get their money, right? I'm just saying, mainstream media is fluid, y'all. Anywho's, nothing in this order shall be construed to impair or otherwise affect the authority granted by law to an executive department, shall not be considered creating any right or benefit. So somebody can't go up and demand that they get, whatever treatment or whatever, because it's at their discretion, right? But I just see that they're going to be rounding people up, and this will give, if they're not eligible because they're undocumented, or if, they're treating them as detainees, which I don't think that's okay. I don't think it's okay to arrest anybody who's living in a tent. Ask them to leave, but no, you may not round them up and treat them like you can stick them in a jail until they're assessed, and that's just not okay. It's just not okay. But we shall see. This is new. It just was ordered yesterday. It's kind of making its waves in the mainstream media, and I'm going to be watching like a hawk to make sure that no veterans are abused, and anybody's abused, right? But I am a veteran, and I have a lot of veteran brothers and sisters across the country, and I'm just like, I've been advocating for, it's just sad. It's just sad that 22 veterans, and the veterans are a very tiny, tiny part of population. They call them the 3%, but they're such a small percent of the population, and there's so many unique, almost esoteric things that involve veterans with the chemical exposures from various things that doctors in normal hospitals and just don't even have experience, but they have funding specifically given to the VA facility. So there should not be the amount of homelessness for veterans. It's criminal, really. And so I want to make sure that if veterans get rounded up in these tents, that they are taken to the VA and actually taken care of as they should be, and most certainly not put in a jail or institutionalized without due process. But I want to make sure that nobody is violated their due process if they're going to take their freedom from them. This can have a wide range of abuses if it's not followed by watch group people. So anyways, that is it for this one, and I hope that people will keep this whole crisis in prayer. And I know a lot of people think, well, mental illness is like evil. I know there's a lot of people that think that, but the brain is an organ, and it functions on the very things that God created it. Okay, yes, mental illness can be demonic illness, but again, an organ, if it is diseased, it needs prayed over. But an organ that is damaged, okay, absent a miracle of God, can create havoc in the body. And that is where behavioral issues come from, if there is chemical imbalances from various chemical exposures or, injuries, etc., etc. I'm just asking people, please don't be stereotypical with the mentally ill. I hope you have a blessed day. Bye.